The question is likely to be asked, in the view of so much evidence to show that Christian theology is only a potpourri of pagan mythologies, how can it be connected with the religion of Moses? The early Christians, Paul and his disciples, the Gnostics and their successors generally, regarded Christianity and Judaism as essentially distinct. The latter, in their view, was an antagonistic system and from a lower origin. "Ye received the law," said Stephen, "from the ministration of angels or eons, and not from the Most High himself." The Gnostics, as we have seen, taught that Jehovah, the deity of the Jews, was Ildabaoth, the son of the ancient Bohu, or Chaos, the adversary of divine wisdom. The question may be more than easily answered. The law of Moses and the so-called monotheism of the Jews can hardly be said to have been more than 2 or 3 centuries older than Christianity. The Pentateuch itself, we are able to show, was written and revised upon this new departure at a period subsequent to the colonization of Judea under the authority of the kings of Persia. The Christian fathers, in their eagerness to make their new system dovetail with Judaism and so avoid paganism, unconsciously shunned Scylla only to be caught in the whirlpool of Charybdis. Under the monotheistic stucco of Judaism was unearthed the same familiar mythology of paganism. But we should not regard the Israelites with less favor for having had a Moloch and being like the natives, nor should we compel the Jews to do penance for their fathers. They had their prophets and their law and were satisfied with them. How faithfully and nobly they have stood by their ancestral faith under the most diabolical persecutions. The present remains of a once glorious people bear witness. The Christian world has been in a state of convulsion from the first to the present century. It has been cleft into thousands of sects. But the Jews remain substantially united. Even their differences of opinion do not destroy their unity. The Christian virtues inculcated by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount are nowhere exemplified in the Christian world. The Buddhist ascetics and Indian fakirs seem almost the only ones that inculcate and practice them. Meanwhile, the vices which coarse-mouthed slanderers have attributed to paganism are current everywhere among Christian fathers and Christian churches. The boasted wide gap between Christianity and Judaism that is claimed on the authority of Paul exists but in the imagination of the pious. We are naught but the inheritors of the intolerant Israelites of ancient days, not the Hebrews of the time of Herod and the Roman dominion, who with all their faults kept strictly orthodox and monotheistic, but the Jews who under the name of Jehovah Nissi worshipped Bacchus Osiris, Dionysos, the multiform Jove of Nisa, the Sinai of Moses. The Kabbalistic demons, allegories of the profoundest meaning, were adopted as objective entities, and a satanic hierarchy carefully drawn by the orthodox demonologists. And more than ever, do we begin to find out by the bright light of comparative theology that the great object of Jesus, the initiate of the inner sanctuary, was to open the eyes of the fanatical multitude to the difference between the highest divinity, the mysterious, never-mentioned Iao of the ancient Chaldean and later Neoplatonic initiates, and the Hebrew Yahu, or Yahweh, Jehovah. Let it not be imagined that we bring this reproach to any who revere Jesus as God. Whatever the faith, if the worshipper be but sincere, it should be respected in his presence. If we do not accept Jesus as God, we revere him as a man. Such a feeling honors him more than if we were to attribute to him the powers and personality of the Supreme, and credit him at the same time with having played a useless comedy with mankind, as after all his mission proved scarcely less than a complete failure. 2,000 years have passed, and Christians do not reckon 1/5 part of the population of the globe, nor is Christianity likely to progress any better in the future. No, we aim but at strict justice, leaving all personality aside. We question those who, adoring neither Jesus, Pythagoras, nor Apollonius, yet recite the idle gossip of their contemporaries. Those who in their books either maintain a prudent silence or speak of our Savior and our Lord as though they believed any more in the made-up theological Christ than in the fabulous foe of China. There were no atheists in those days of old, no disbelievers or materialists in the modern sense of the word, as there were no bigoted detractors. He who judges the ancient philosophies by their external phraseology and quotes from ancient writings sentences seemingly atheistical is unfit to be trusted as a critic, for he is unable to penetrate into the inner sense of their metaphysics. Comparative theology is a two-edged weapon and has so proved itself. But the Christian advocates, unabashed by evidence, force comparison in the serenest way. Christian legends and dogmas, they say, do somewhat resemble the heathen, it is true. But see, while the one teaches us the existence, powers, and attributes of an all-wise, all-good Father God, Brahmanism gives us a multitude of minor gods, and Buddhism none whatever. One is fetishism and polytheism, the other bald atheism. Jehovah is the one true God, and the Pope and Martin Luther are his prophets. This is one edge of the sword, and this the other. Despite missions, despite armies, despite enforced commercial intercourse, the heathen find nothing in the teachings of Jesus, sublime though some are, that Krishna and Gautama had not taught them before. And so to gain over any new converts and keep the few already won by centuries of cunning, the Christians give the heathen dogmas more absurd than their own and cheat them by adopting the habit of their native priests and practicing the very idolatry and fetishism which they so disparage in the heathens. Comparative theology works both ways. But as the work of translation and analysis progresses, fresh religious beauties will be discovered in the old faiths. Indeed, it is more than difficult to avoid sharing this doctrine of periodical incarnations. Has not the world witnessed at rare intervals the advent of such grand characters as Krishna, Sakyamuni, and Jesus? Like the two latter personages, Krishna seems to have been a real being, deified by his school at some time in the twilight of history and made to fit into the frame of the time-honored religious program. Compare the two redeemers, the Hindu and the Christian, the one preceding the other by some thousands of years. Place between them Siddhartha Buddha reflecting Krishna and projecting into the night of the future his own luminous shadow, out of whose collected rays were shaped the outlines of the mythical Jesus, and from whose teachings were drawn those of the historical Christos. And we find that under one identical garment of poetical legend lived and breathed three real human figures. The individual merit of each of them is rather brought out in stronger relief than otherwise by this same mythical coloring, for no unworthy character could have been selected for deification by the popular instinct, so unerring and just when left untrammeled. Vox populi, vox Dei was once true, however erroneous when applied to the present priest-ridden mob. Capella, Orpheus, Pythagoras, Plato, Basilides, Marcion, Ammonius, and Plotinus founded schools and sowed the germs of many a noble thought, and disappearing left behind them the refulgence of demigods. But the three personalities of Krishna, Gautama, and Jesus appear like true gods, each in his own epoch, and bequeathed to humanity three religions built on the imperishable rock of ages. That all three, especially the Christian faith, have in time become adulterated, and the latter almost unrecognizable, is no fault of either the noble reformers. It is the priestly, self-styled husbandmen of the vine of the Lord who must be held to account by future generations. Purify the three systems of the dross of human dogmas, the pure essence remaining will be found identical. Even Paul the Great, the honest apostle, in the glow of his enthusiasm, either unwittingly perverted the doctrines of Jesus, or else his writings are disfigured beyond recognition. Can the results of a crime be obliterated even though the crime itself should be pardoned? The effects of a cause are never limited to the boundaries of the cause, nor can the results of crime be confined to the offender and his victim. Every good as well as evil action has its effects, as palpably as the stone flung into calm water. The simile is trite, but it is the best ever conceived, so let us use it. The eddying circles are greater and swifter as the disturbing object is greater or smaller, but the smallest pebble, nay, the tiniest speck, makes its ripples. And this disturbance is not alone visible and on the surface. Below, unseen in every direction, outward and downward, drop pushes drop until the sides and bottom are touched by the force. More, the air above the water is agitated, and this disturbance passes, as the physicists tell us, from stratum to stratum, out into space, forever and ever, an impulse has been given to matter, and that is never lost, can never be recalled. So with crime, and so with its opposite. The action may be instantaneous, the effects are eternal. When after the stone is once flung into the pond, we can recall it to the hand, roll back the ripples, obliterate the force expended, restore the etheric waves to their previous state of non-being, and wipe out every trace of the act of throwing the missile, so that time's record shall not show that it ever happened, then we may patiently hear Christians argue for the efficacy of this atonement. The Chicago Times recently printed the hangman's record of the first half of the present year, 1877. A long and ghastly record of murders and hangings. Nearly every one of these murders received religious consolation, and many announced that they had received God's forgiveness through the blood of Jesus and were going that day to heaven. Their conversion was effected in prison. See how this ledger balance of Christian justice stands? These red-handed murderers, urged on by the demons of lust, revenge, cupidity, fanaticism, or mere brutal thirst for blood, slew their victims, in most cases, without giving them time to repent or call on Jesus to wash them clean with his blood. They perhaps died sinful and, of course, consistently with theological logic, met the reward of their greater or lesser offenses. But the murderer, overtaken by human justice, is imprisoned, wept over by sentimentalists, prayed with and at, pronounces the charmed words of conversion, and goes to the scaffold, a redeemed child of Jesus. Except for the murderer, he would not have been prayed with, redeemed, pardoned. Clearly this man did well to murder, for thus he gained eternal happiness. And how about the victim and his or her family, relatives, dependents, social relations? Has justice no recompense for them? Must they suffer in this world and the next, while he who wronged them sits beside the holy thief of Calvary and is forever blessed? On this question, the clergy keep a prudent silence. Despite the notable similarity of the direct teachings of Gautama and Jesus, we yet find their respective followers starting from two diametrically opposite points. The Buddhist divine, following literally the ethical doctrine of his master, remains thus true to the legacy of Gautama, while the Christian minister, distorting the precepts recorded by the four Gospels beyond recognition, teaches not that which Jesus taught, but the absurd, too often pernicious interpretations of infallible men, popes, Luthers, and Calvins included. The following are two instances selected from both religions and brought into contrast. Let the reader judge for himself. Do not believe in anything because it is rumored and spoken of by many, says Buddha. Do not think that it is a proof of its truth. Do not believe merely because the written statement of some old sage is produced. Do not be sure that the writing has ever been revised by the said sage or can be relied on. Do not believe in what you have fancied, thinking that because an idea is extraordinary, it must have been implanted by a deva or some wonderful being. Do not believe in guesses, that is, assuming something at haphazard as a starting point, and then drawing conclusions from it, reckoning your 2 and your 3 and your 4 before you have fixed your number 1. Do not believe merely on the authority of your teachers and masters, or believe in practice merely because they believe in practice. I, Buddha, tell you all, you must of yourselves know that this is evil, this is punishable, this is censured by wise men. Belief in this will bring no advantage to anyone, but will cause sorrow, and when you know this, then eschew it. Once that an adept was initiated into the last and most solemn mystery of life transfer, the awful 7th rite of the great sacerdotal operation, which is the highest theurgy, he belonged no more to this world. His soul was free thereafter, and the 7 mortal sins lying in wait to devour his heart, as the soul, liberated by death, would be crossing the 7 halls and 7 staircases, could hurt him no more, alive or dead. He has passed the twice 7 trials, the 12 labors of the final hour. The High Hierophant alone knew how to perform this solemn operation by infusing his own vital life and astral soul into the adept, chosen by him for his successor, who thus became endowed with a double life. Buddha teaches the doctrine of a new birth as plainly as Jesus does. Desiring to break with the ancient mysteries to which it was impossible to admit the ignorant masses, the Hindu reformer, though generally silent upon more than one secret dogma, clearly states his thought in several passages. Thus he says, "Some people are born again, evildoers go to hell, righteous people go to heaven, those who are free from all worldly desires enter nirvana." Precepts of the Dhammapada. Elsewhere, Buddha states that it is better to believe in a future life in which happiness or misery can be felt. For if the heart believes therein, it will abandon sin and act virtuously, and even if there is no resurrection, such a life will bring a good name and the regard of men. But those who believe in extinction and death will not fail to commit any sin that they may choose because of their disbelief in a future. That there are fearful secrets in nature may well be believed when, as we have seen in the case of the Russian Znachar, the sorcerer cannot die until he has passed the word to another. And the hierophants of white magic rarely do. It seems as if the dread power of the word could only be entrusted to one man of a certain district or body of people at a time. When the Brahmatma was about to lay aside the burden of physical existence, he imparted his secret to his successor, either orally or by a writing placed in a securely fastened casket, which went into the latter's hands alone. Moses lays his hands upon his neophyte, Joshua in the solitudes of Nebo, and passes away forever. Aaron initiates Eleazar on Mount Hor and dies. Siddhartha Buddha promises his mendicants before his death to live in him who shall deserve it, embraces his favorite disciple, whispers in his ear, and dies. And as John's head lies upon the bosom of Jesus, he is told that he shall tarry until he shall come. Like signal fires of the olden times, which lighted and extinguished by turns upon one hilltop after another, conveyed intelligence along a whole stretch of country. So we see a long line of wise men from the beginning of history down to our own times, communicating the word of wisdom to their direct successors. Passing from seer to seer, the word flashes out like lightning, and while carrying off the initiator from human sight forever, brings the new initiate into view. Meanwhile, whole nations murder each other in the name of another word, an empty substitute accepted literally by each and misinterpreted by all. Yes, these are the blessings that the modern Christian religion brings with its Bibles and catechisms into the poor heathen. Rum and bastardy to Hindustan, opium to China, rum and foul disorders to Tahiti, and worst of all, the example of hypocrisy in religion and a practical skepticism in atheism, which, since it seems to be good enough for civilized people, may well in time be thought good enough for those whom theology has too often been holding under a very heavy yoke. On the other hand, everything that is noble, spiritual, elevating in the old religion is denied and even deliberately falsified. Primitive peoples have disappeared, but primitive wisdom survives, and it is attainable by those who will, dare, and can keep silent. The cornerstone of magic is an intimate, practical knowledge of magnetism and electricity, their qualities, correlations, and potencies. Especially necessary is a familiarity with their effects in and upon the animal kingdom and man. There are occult properties in many other minerals, equally strange with that in the lodestone, which all practitioners of magic must know, and of which so-called exact science is wholly ignorant. Plants also have like mystical properties in a most wonderful degree, and the secrets of the herbs of dreams and enchantments are only lost to European science, and useless to say, too, are unknown to it, except in a few marked instances, such as opium and hashish. Yet the psychical effects of even these few upon the human system are regarded as evidences of a temporary mental disorder. The women of Thessaly and Epirus, the female hierophants of the rites of Sabazius, did not carry their secrets away with the downfall of their sanctuaries. They are still preserved, and those who are aware of the nature of soma know the properties of other plants as well. To sum up all in a few words, magic is spiritual wisdom. nature the material ally, pupil, and servant of the magician. One common vital principle pervades all things, and this is controllable by the perfected human will. The adept can stimulate the movements of the natural forces in plants and animals in a preternatural degree. Such experiments are not obstructions of nature, but quickenings. The conditions of intenser vital action are given. The adept can control the sensations and alter the conditions of the physical and astral bodies of other persons, not adepts. He can also govern and employ, as he chooses, the spirits of the elements. He cannot control the immortal spirit of any human being, living or dead, for all such spirits are alike sparks of the divine essence and not subject to any foreign domination. There are two kinds of seership, that of the soul and that of the spirit. The seership of the ancient Pythonists or of the modern mesmerized subject varied but in the artificial modes adopted to induce the state of clairvoyance. But as the visions of both depend upon the greater or less acuteness of the senses of the astral body, they differ very widely from the perfect omniscient spiritual state, for at best the subject can get but glimpses of truth through the veil which physical nature interposes. The astral principle or mind, called by the Hindu yogin Fav Atma, is the sentient soul, inseparable from our physical brain, which it holds in subjection and is in its turn equally trammeled by it. This is the material body. The clearness and correctness of its spiritual visions depend upon its more or less intimate relation with its higher principle. When this relation is such as to allow the most ethereal portions of the soul essence to act independently of its grosser particles and of the brain, it can unerringly comprehend what it sees. Then only is it the pure, rational, supersentient soul. That state is known in India as the samadhi. It is the highest condition of spirituality possible to man on earth. Fakirs try to obtain such a condition by holding their breath for hours together during their religious exercises, and call this practice Dham Sadhana. The Hindu terms pranayama, pratyahara, and dharana all relate to different psychological states and show how much more the Sanskrit and even the modern Hindu language are adapted to the clear elucidation of the phenomena that are encountered by those who study this branch of psychological science than the tongues of modern peoples, whose experiences have not yet necessitated the invention of such descriptive terms. Many of the lamaseries contain schools of magic, but the most celebrated is the collegiate monastery of the Shutukt, where there are over 30,000 monks attached to it, the lamasery forming quite a little city. Some of the female nuns possess marvelous psychological powers. We have met some of these women on their way from Lhasa to Kandy, the Rome of Buddhism, with its miraculous shrines and Gautama's relics. To avoid encounters with Musulmans and other sects, they travel by night alone, unarmed and without the least fear of wild animals, for these will not touch them. At the first glimpses of dawn, they take refuge in caves and viharas, prepared for them by their co-religionists at calculated distances, for notwithstanding the fact that Buddhism has taken refuge in Ceylon, and nominally there are but few of the denomination in British India, yet the secret Biauds, or brotherhoods, and Buddhist viharas are numerous, and every Jain feels himself obliged to help, indiscriminately, Buddhist or Lamaist. A great truth was uttered some 50 years ago by Francis Victor Broussais, when he said, "If magnetism were true, medicine would be an absurdity." Magnetism is true, and so we shall not contradict the learned Frenchman as to the rest. Magnetism, as we have shown, is the alphabet of magic. It is idle for anyone to attempt to understand either the theory or the practice of the latter until the fundamental principle of magnetic attractions and repulsions throughout nature is recognized. Many so-called popular superstitions are but evidences of an instinctive perception of this law, and untutored people are taught by the experience of many generations that certain phenomena occur under fixed conditions. They give these conditions and obtain the expected results. Ignorant of the laws, they explain the fact by supernaturalism, for experience has been their sole teacher. In India, as well as in Russia and some other countries, there is an instinctive repugnance to stepping across a man's shadow. especially if he have red hair, and in the former country, natives are extremely reluctant to shake hands with persons of another race. These are not idle fancies. Every person admits a magnetic exhalation, or aura, and a man may be in perfect physical health, but at the same time his exhalation may have a morbific character for others, sensitive to such subtle influences. Dr. Esdale and other mesmerists long since taught us that Oriental people, especially Hindus, are more susceptible than the white-skinned races. Baron Reichenbach's experiments, and in fact the world's entire experience, prove that these magnetic exhalations are most intense from the extremities. Therapeutic manipulations show this. Handshaking is therefore most calculated to communicate antipathetic magnetic conditions, and the Hindus do wisely in keeping their ancient superstition derived from Manu constantly in mind. Another prevalent belief in some parts of Russia, particularly Georgia, the Caucasus, and in India, is that in case the body of a drowned person cannot be otherwise found, if a garment of his be thrown into the water, it will float until directly over the spot, and then sink. What is now generally known as shamanism is very little, and that has been perverted like the rest of the non-Christian religions. It is called the heathenism of Mongolia, and wholly without reason, for it is one of the oldest religions of India. It is spirit worship, or belief in the immortality of the souls, and that the latter are still the same men they were on earth, though their bodies have lost their objective form, and man has exchanged his physical for a spiritual nature. In its present shape, it is an offshoot of primitive theurgy and a practical blending of the visible with the invisible world. Whenever a denizen of earth desires to enter into communication with his invisible brethren, he has to assimilate himself to their nature, i.e., he meets these beings halfway, and furnished by them with a supply of spiritual essence, endows them in his turn with a portion of his physical nature, thus enabling them sometimes to appear in a semi-objective form. It is a temporary exchange of natures called theurgy. Shamans are called sorcerers because they are said to evoke the spirits of the dead for purposes of necromancy. The true shamanism, striking features of which prevailed in India in the days of Megasthenes, 300 BC, can no more be judged by its degenerated scions among the shamans of Siberia than the religion of Gautama Buddha can be interpreted by the fetishism of some of his followers in Siam and Burma. It is the chief lamasseries of Mongolia and Tibet that it has taken refuge, and there, shamanism, if so we must call it, is practiced to the utmost limits of intercourse allowed between man and spirit. The religion of the lamas has faithfully preserved the primitive science of magic and produces as great feats now as it did in the days of Kublai Khan and his barons. The ancient mystic formula of the king Shrong Chisan's Gampo, the Am Mani Padme Hum, affects its wonders now as well as in the 7th century. Avalokitesvara, highest of the three bodhisattvas and patron saint of Tibet, projects his shadow full in the view of the faithful at the lamasery of Diga Gadan, founded by him, and the luminous form of Sun Kapa, under the shape of a fiery cloudlet that separates itself from the dancing beams of the sunlight, holds converse with a great congregation of lamas, numbering thousands, the voice descending from above like the whisper of the breeze through the foliage. Anon, say the Tibetans, the beautiful appearance vanishes in the shadows of the sacred trees in the park of the lamasery. But the theoretical study of magic is one thing, the possibility of practicing it quite another. At Brassus-Pungs, the Mongolian college, where over 300 magicians, sorciers, as the French missionaries call them, teach about twice as many pupils from 12 to 20, the latter of many years to wait for their final initiation. Not 1 in 100 reaches the highest goal, and out of the many thousand lamas occupying nearly an entire city of detached buildings clustering around it, not more than 2% become wonder workers. One may learn by heart every line of the 108 volumes of Kajur and still make but a poor practical magician. There is but one thing which leads surely to it, and this particular study is hinted at by more than one Hermetic writer. One, the Arabian alchemist Abipili, speaks thus: I admonish thee, whosoever thou art that desirest to dive into the inmost parts of nature. If that thou seekest, thou findest not within thee, thou wilt never find it without thee. If thou knowest not the excellency of thine own house, why dost thou seek after the excellency of other things? O man, know thyself, in thee is hid the treasure of treasures. What Marco Polo testifies to in the 13th century is corroborated in our own days. There are another class of people called Chugi, yogi, he says, who are indeed properly called Abrahmans, possibly Brahmins, who are extremely long-lived, every man of them living to 150 or 200 years. They eat very little, rice and milk chiefly, and these people make use of a very strange beverage, a potion of sulfur and quicksilver mixed together, and this they drink twice every month. This, they say, gives them long life, and it is a potion they are used to take from their childhood. Bernier shows, says Colonel Yule, the yogis very skillful in preparing mercury, so admirably that 1 or 2 grains taken every morning restored the body to perfect health, and adds that the mercurius vitae of Paracelsus was a compound in which entered antimony and quicksilver. This is a very careless statement, to say the least, and we will explain what we know of it. The longevity of some lamas and talapoins is proverbial, and it is generally known that they use some compound which renews the old blood, as they call it. And it was equally a recognized fact with alchemists that a judicious administration of aura of silver does restore health and prolongs life itself to a wonderful extent. But we are fully prepared to oppose the statements of both Bernier and Colonel Yule, who quotes him, that it is mercury or quicksilver which the yogis and the alchemists used. The yogis in the days of Marco Polo, as well as in our modern times, do use that which may appear to be quicksilver, but it is not. Paracelsus, the alchemists, and other mystics meant by mercurius vitae the living spirit of silver. The living spirit of silver. The aura of silver, not the argent viva. And this aura, not the argent vive. And this aura is certainly not the mercury known to our physicians and druggists. There can be no doubt that the imputation that Paracelsus introduced mercury into medical practice is utterly incorrect. No mercury, whether prepared by a medieval fire philosopher or a modern self-styled physician, can or ever did restore the body to perfect health. Only an unmitigated charlatan will ever use such a drug. And it is the opinion of many that it is just with the wicked intention of presenting Paracelsus in the eyes of posterity as a quack that his enemies have invented such a preposterous lie. The yogis of the olden times, as well as modern lamas and talapoins, use a certain ingredient with a minimum of sulfur and a milky juice, which they extract from a medicinal plant. The stories, hitherto considered fables of Krishna and Orpheus, charming the wild beasts, thus receives its corroboration in our day. There's one fact which remains undeniable. There's not a single European in India who could have or has ever boasted of having penetrated into the enclosed sanctuary within the pagodas. Neither authority nor money has ever induced a Brahmin to allow an uninitiated foreigner to pass the threshold of the reserved precinct. To use authority in such a case would be equivalent to throwing a lighted taper into a powder magazine. The Hindus, mild, patient, long-suffering, whose very apathy saved the British from being driven out of the country in 1857, would raise their 100 millions of devotees as one man at such a profanation. Regardless of sects or castes, they would exterminate every Christian. The East India Company knew this well and built her stronghold on the friendship of the Brahmins, and by paying subsidy to the pagodas, and the British government is as prudent as its predecessor. It is the castes and non-interference with the prevailing religions that secure its comparative authority in India. But we must once more recur to shamanism, that strange and most despised of all surviving religions, spirit worship. Its followers have neither altars nor idols, and it is upon the authority of a shaman priest that we state that their true rites, which they are bound to perform only once a year, on the shortest day of winter cannot take place before any stranger to their faith. Therefore, we are confident that all descriptions hitherto given in the Asiatic Journal and other European works are but guesswork. The Russians, who from constant intercourse with the shamans in Siberia and Tartary, would be the most competent of all persons to judge of their religion, have learned nothing except of the personal proficiency of these men in what they are half inclined to believe clever jugglery. Many Russian residents, though in Siberia, are firmly convinced of the supernatural powers of the shamans. Whenever they assemble to worship, it is always in an open space or a high hill or in the hidden depths of a forest, in this reminding us of the old Druidical rites. Their ceremonies upon the occasions of births, deaths, and marriages are but trifling parts of their worship. They comprise offerings, the sprinkling of the fire with spirits and milk, and weird hymns, or rather magical incantations, intoned by the officiating shaman, and concluding with a chorus of the persons present. The shamans of Siberia are all ignorant and illiterate. Those of Tartary and Tibet, few in number, are mostly learned men in their own way, and will not allow themselves to fall under the control of spirits of any kind. The former are mediums in the full sense of the word, the latter magicians. It is not surprising that pious and superstitious persons, after seeing one of such crises, should declare the shaman to be under demoniacal possession. As in the instances of Corbantic and Bacchantic fury among the ancient Greeks, the spiritual crisis of the shaman exhibits itself in violent dancing and wild gestures. Little by little, the lookers-on feel the spirit of imitation aroused in them, seized with an irresistible impulse. They dance and become, in their turn, ecstatics, and he who begins by joining the chorus gradually and unconsciously takes part in the gesticulations until he sinks to the ground exhausted, and often dying. O young girl, a god possesses thee. It is either Pan or Hecate, or the venerable Corybantes, or Cybele that agitates thee, the chorus says, addressing Phaedra in Euripides. This form of psychological epidemic has been too well known from the time of the Middle Ages to cite instances from it. The Coroeus Sancti Vitae is an historical fact and spread throughout Germany. Paracelsus cured quite a number of persons possessed of such a spirit of imitation, but he was a Kabbalist and therefore accused by his enemies of having cast out the devils by the power of a stronger demon, which he was believed to carry about with him in the hilt of his sword. The Christian judges of those days of horror found a better and a surer remedy. Voltaire states that in the district of Jura between 1598 and 1600, over 600 lycanthropes were put to death by a pious judge. But while the illiterate shaman is a victim and during his crisis sometimes sees the persons present under the shape of various animals and often makes them share his hallucination, his brother shaman, learned in the mysteries of the priestly colleges of Tibet, expels the elementary creature which can produce the hallucination as well as a living mesmerizer, not through the help of a stronger demon, but simply through his knowledge of the nature of the invisible enemy. Where academicians have failed, as in the cases of the Sevenoi, a shaman or a lama would have soon put an end to the epidemic. By those who have followed us thus far, it will naturally be asked, to what practical issue this book tends? Much has been said about magic and its potentiality, much of the immense antiquity of its practice. Do we wish to affirm that the occult sciences ought to be studied and practiced throughout the world? Would we replace modern spiritualism with the ancient magic? Neither the substitution could not be made, nor the study universally prosecuted, without incurring the risk of enormous public dangers. At this moment, a well-known spiritualist and lecturer on mesmerism is imprisoned on the charge of raping a subject whom he had hypnotized. A sorcerer is a public enemy, and mesmerism may most readily be turned into the worst of sorceries. We would have neither scientists, theologians, nor spiritualists turned practical magicians, but all to realize that there was true science, profound religion, and genuine phenomena before this modern era. We would that all who have a voice in the education of the masses should first know and then teach that the safest guides to human happiness and enlightenment are those writings which have descended to us from the remotest antiquity, and that nobler spiritual aspirations and a higher average morality prevail in the countries where the people take their precepts as the rule of their lives. We would have all to realize that magical, i.e. spiritual powers, exist in every man, and those few to practice them who feel called to teach and are ready to pay the price of discipline and self-conquest which their development exacts. Many men have arisen who had glimpses of the truth and fancied they had it all. Such have failed to achieve the good they might have done and sought to do because vanity has made them thrust their personality into such undue prominence as to interpose it between their believers and the whole truth that lay behind. The world needs no sectarian church, whether of Buddha, Jesus, Mahomet, Swedenborg, Calvin, or any other, there being but one truth. Man requires but one church, the temple of God within us, walled in by matter, but penetrable by anyone who can find the way, the pure in heart, see God. The trinity of nature is the lock of magic. The trinity of man, the key that fits it.